Hello, my name is Tim Malone and I'm a history teacher. And today we're going to talk about the results of the American Revolution. Now, you might say, well, duh, independence, right? Well, of course. All right, independence. The first new nation, a new country. At the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and let's remember there's two treaties of Paris, right? In 1763, the treaty that ends the French and Indian War, which we posited as one of the underlying causes of the American Revolution, was called the Treaty of Paris. 20 years later, in 1783, there's a second Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution, or the American Revolutionary War, because the Revolution, of course, goes on for a little bit while longer. Most historians think the Revolutionary era culminates in the writing of the Constitution in 1787. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, where the English, in plain English, say the 13 colonies of North America are not ours anymore. We recognize them as a new nation. We recognize them as a new country. And that's plain, straightforward. There's a new nation. Now, we talked in the episode before this on the underlying causes of the American Revolution. We talked about underlying cause, the rise of American nationalism. And we talked about the morass that studies of nationalism is. Nationalism is one of the most important concepts in history. Nationalism. And what's nationalism? Nationalism is the idea that human societies are, and of right ought to be, divided into these things called nation states. And that the nation state is the quintessential division of human societies, of human civilizations, and it's the arbiter of the futures, the presence and the futures of the people who live within it. The nation state controls those people, and of right ought to. See, a nationalist, a hardcore nationalist, thinks the nation is the fundamental entity, is the irreducible entity. That's problematic. I mean, nationalism has caused more deaths than any other ism in history. And you're saying, oh, now, wait a minute, religion. Well, yeah, religions run up quite a total too. But the 20th century, World War I and World War II, plus all those wars of national liberation and all those wars to be free from colonial rule in the 20th century, those are wars of nationalism, and they were so exceptionally bloody that they swamped the Crusades and the purges in the Middle Ages and all that, bloody, nasty affairs. But the wars of nationalism in the 20th century, oh my God, millions and millions and millions. So nationalism is, and I don't know, I'm a nationalist. I mean, aren't we all? But it's obvious that nationalism can go too far. That there's such a thing as an excess of nationalism. I mean, look at Nazi Germany in the 30s, or Imperial Japan during the same time period. Excess, totalitarian, genocidal nationalism. Nationalism. I don't think that most Americans or most people in the world think enough about nationalism. Now, we should say this, right? Because we're in a period of globalization, right? That's all you hear. Well, that's the opposite of nationalism, globalism, if you want to think of it that way. And so, which is it? Are we inevitably moving towards one Earth, which makes sense because it's obvious isn't it? That the planet is the unit. The planet's the unit, right? No, no, a nationalist. No, no, the planet's not the unit. The nation state is the unit. So that conflict is ongoing because, the number of nations, what are we at? 203? South Sudan, just a couple of years ago, South Sudan became the 201st or 202nd nation. It depends on how you count them up, which shows you the ambiguities involved in this idea of nationalism because people count up different numbers. There's continually new nations. So is 201 it? Probably not. So are we in an age of nationalism or in an age of globalism? Can nationalism, think about it, because the nation state still, you're supposed to want to die for your country. You're supposed to want to die for your country. That's culturally sanctioned. Now, I don't know what else you're supposed to want to die for. I guess your family, right? It's culturally sanctioned to die for your family, although I don't know. Am I supposed to take a bullet for my wife? I mean, I don't know. She's an adult, right? Well, I mean, certainly your kids, right? But what else? Now, it used to be for your religion. I went to a Catholic grade school, and we were taught about the holy martyrs who, the commies had come in and pointed a gun at them. Are you a Catholic? Yes. Boom, bang. And, I was supposed to die for the church at one time. I don't know. I think that's kind of waned a little bit. But what else are you supposed to die for? You're supposed to want to die for your country. Nationalism. Man, nationalism. We'll come back to nationalism several times in this series. But again, and I repeated this earlier, but let me repeat it again. The United States starts this nationalism thing. We're the first modern nation. Independence, the new country, results of the American Revolution. The second result of the American Revolution is continuing problems with England. The World War between France and England doesn't end with either the French and Indian War or the American Revolutionary War. And of course, the French come in 1777. The French ally with the American rebels against England. And in this series of wars between France and England for superpower status, which culminates in Napoleon and the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, in that series of wars, the only time the French win one is when they fight with the American colonies in the American Revolutionary War. That's the only time the French win. And they get very little out of that except more debt, which will ultimately lead to the French Revolution. And, it's interesting because, the culminating battle in the American Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown, where 8,000 British troops end up surrendering, and that's, England finally decides, that's it, we can't win this war. And the reason that Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown is because a French fleet defeated a British fleet off the Virginia coast in a naval battle, the only time in this 123-year war between the French and the English that a French fleet defeated a British fleet was in our Revolution. It's interesting. But the continuing problems with England. I mean, we'll have to fight England again in the War of 1812. What this means is that for the young nation, the new United States, foreign policy, trying to navigate this world war between the French and the English and trying to navigate the continued British hostility. I mean, the British signed a peace treaty in 1783 and recognized the independence of the United States, but they continued to wage economic war on the new nation. British or American merchant shipping is still banned even after the treaty from England and from British colonies, and the British are the main empire in the world. some historians describe it as that the British continue to wage economic war on the new nation, and therefore the first 30 years of American independence are obsessed with European power politics, are obsessed with relations between England and France and the United States, and throw Spain in there too. And that will last until the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. Foreign policy will loom large for the new nation. Results of the American Revolution. The American Revolution is a disaster for Native Americans. It's a disaster. The English, the French before them, and the English had maintained an alliance with Native Americans west of the Appalachian Mountains in the Ohio, Great Lakes, Mississippi River Valley region in order to get the Native Americans to harvest furs in the lucrative, very lucrative fur trade. I mean, we think about the New World, right? When the Spanish come, gold and silver, right? And we think about tobacco from the Chesapeake region, and indigo, and sugar, of course, in the Caribbean area, as the wealth producing resources of the New World. But don't underestimate the lucrative nature of the fur trade. It ran the French Empire for 70 years, and the English enthusiastically replaced the French west of the mountains. And that's one of the reasons for the American Revolution, was the way the English tried to prohibit the colonists from the Ohio River Valley. So now the English are gone from west of the mountains, and here come the Americans. The Americans are coming, and they're not coming to be friendly with Native Americans to harvest furs. They're coming for the land. The new nation, like the colonies before them, are settler. It's a settler nation. It's a farmer nation. They're coming to take the land, cut the trees down, and establish farms. And it's going to be it's going to be a disaster for Native Americans. A disaster. Now, they'll put up a good fight, the Native Americans, but the die is cast once the English are gone. Now, the English will continue, despite the fact that the area west of the mountains, south of the Great Lakes and west of the mountains, will become part of the United States. The English will continue to tamper, the way the United States puts it. Those English, we talked about continuing problems with England as one of the results. One of them is that they continue to tamper with our Indians. They continue to trade with them, sell them guns, gunpowder. Yeah, the Americans are coming for the land, and the die is cast for Native Americans. We'll talk more about this. We'll come back to Native Americans again. The fourth result of the American Revolution is that the country is born with a West. The country is born with a West, and I put that in quotation marks. Whoa, this is a very, very interesting story. And again, something that is overlooked, not emphasized in the history books. Now, what do I mean, the West? The West. The country is born with a West. Now, most Americans understand the importance culturally of the West in American history and in American culture. We have a genre of movies, literature, plays called the Western. Now, when I was a kid, there were a long time ago, there were 25 Westerns on weekly network TV. Westerns. The Western. Now, the Western's pretty much gone out of vogue. Occasionally you get a Western. I can't remember the last Western movie that was made. I mean, there was Dances with Wolves, but that's a while ago now. Occasionally you still get a Western made. Westerns dominated American cinema and America TV for several decades after World War II. And where did they take place? The West. Well, the West as a cultural idea, but the West was also a geographical location. And where is the first West in American history? It's the area west of the Appalachian Mountains and to the Mississippi River. And here, of course, a map. This is a very, very interesting story. And this is one of the most important facts in American history, that the area between the mountains and the Mississippi River was thrown in by the English at the peace treaty table in Paris in 1783 to be part of the new nation. The 13 original colonies between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains had no real practical claim on that land. Now, the colonial charters of various states included it, but that was just theoretical. And yet, it becomes part of the United States. A huge, mostly vacant, and of course it's interesting, the language we use isn't vacant. There's Native Americans out there, but oh no, it's, and our founding fathers used that term, right? Americans have used that term for our West all the time. Well, there's vacant land out there. Native Americans don't count, right? There's vacant land out there. And let me put up a different iteration of it. In this map, it's the dark brown area. I mean, look at that. Now, that includes Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, plus, Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Louisiana. But let's just talk about the Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio part. That will turn out to be the richest farmland in the world. And it's thrown in at the peace treaty table. Now, there's been books written about what the hell were the English doing? Because it seems to me that if at the peace treaty table, the English had said to the American delegation, you remember that proclamation line of 1763 across the crest of the Appalachian Mountains? That's your country. You have the original 13 colonies between the Atlantic Ocean and the mountains. That's the United States. Take it or leave it. I'm almost absolutely certain that the American delegation would have said, okay, we'll take that as our new country to end the war and to have you recognize us as an independent country. That would have been an entirely different United States and an entirely different United States history. But no, for some reason, and again, there's been books written about this, and I've read those books, and it's like, why did they throw in the richest farmland in the world as a gift to the United States? Why did they make the Mississippi River the western boundary rather than the mountains? Now, literally, there are some pro-English historians, and we'll come back to this, but there was a period after the Civil War up until, I don't know, maybe up until now, where English historians affected American history. Well, they're our great ally. They're our mother country. They're America and England together forever. Uh, um, and the idea was that the English were like being nice to us. Oh, here, cuz, here, have some land. Have some land, a huge piece of land that you have no real right to. Here, cuz, let's be friends. No, we already talked about the fact that the English continued to wage economic war in the new country. The English were hostile. They were still in Canada, of course. No, it wasn't friendship. So what is it? Well, another interpretation is that the English didn't want to defend that piece of real estate. In other words, if the English would have said the mountains are the western boundary of the new United States, they would have had to defend that line. And they're talking about 10 or 20,000 British troops. And there'd been trouble along the mountain line, the Appalachian Mountain line, when the French were there. The Americans probably would have continued to push on that line, so there would have been English troops to keep the new nation confined, and that would have cost money. And the English were deep in debt from this series of wars with England and with the American Revolutionary War, and so they wanted to cut costs, and they said, let the Americans have it. And then there was this side of it. If the Americans have to defend it, that'll be an impediment on them. That'll be a weight on them. That'll be another way for us to wage economic war on them. Is, in other words, here's a piece of land, America, choke on it, right? Choke on it. We're out. We're out of here. Boy, that sure didn't turn out to be the case, though. Again, the richest farmland in the world, and then the Great Lakes Basin will be the, Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit, and Milwaukee. They'll be the basis of America's rise to industrial predominance. The rise to America as industrial superpower will be this same region that's sort of just thrown in. It's again, I don't think this development. That the original United States was the Mississippi River, western boundary, and not the mountains, is just profound. It's profound in our history. You can say that's one of the most important events in American history. But nevertheless, my point is that that's the West. That's the original West, right there. And it includes, I'm in northern Illinois right here, right now. It includes this area right here, the original West. And the settlement of the United States will be east to west. That's just a fact. Perhaps too much has been made out of the West. The Western, of course, these Western movies and Western TV shows portray a culture, a West that never existed, right? I mean, we'll come back to this when we talk about the frontier thesis of American history in a subsequent episode. But, the standing out there at high noon and quick drawing and shooting each other, my understanding is that never happened in history. Never happened. And yet it's pervasive in our literature and in our movies about the West. The results of the American Revolution. Number 5, the Civil War. And you're probably like, what? Yes. A very strong case can be made historically that the Civil War was caused by the American Revolution. And of course, I'm talking about the problem of slavery. A nation half slave and half free. You remember Abraham Lincoln, his famous debate with Stephen Douglas, where he says, a nation half slave and half free cannot survive. It will either become all one or all the other. That circumstance, a nation half slave and half free, was a result of the American Revolution. The American Revolution pushed slavery onto the ideological defensive. And that's a result of the most famous phrase, sentence from the American Revolution that echoes down through the era to today. All men are created equal. All men are created equal. 5 words. The most potent 5 words in the history of the world. Whoa, I don't know. You can make a case for it. All men are created equal. That was part of the stated ideology of the American Revolution. And boy, has it stuck. Now, of course, over the last 50 years, there's been a revision in American history to cast doubt upon the seriousness with which that phrase ought to be taken as regards America and our revolution. Because, of course, the author of the Declaration of Independence, most of it, Thomas Jefferson, one of the most famous Americans that there is, the foundingest of the founding fathers, no, wait, George Washington, well, second. And Thomas Jefferson was a large slave owner. A fact that was kind of overlooked for 200 years, almost 200 years. And then 50 years ago or 40 years ago, that contradiction was heightened, as it should have been in American history. But whether Jefferson meant it or not is kind of irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Whether he knew that he was just trying to propagandize elite opinion in England, which is what most people think, right? That the Declaration of Independence was written for European elites because the Enlightenment was in vogue in France and in Germany and even in England, and the Enlightenment in Europe was liberty and equality were themes in the European Enlightenment. And so Jefferson and the Founding Fathers were attempting with this all men are created equal to appeal to that group of people in Europe, to get them behind our revolution. But again, whether Jefferson was just kind of schizophrenic in his mind, or whether he was a lawyer, so he had this legalistic, well, of course I meant all white men over 21 who own a certain amount of property are created equal. Don't you know? Whether it was that, or whether he was fooling himself, or whether he was just being disingenuous, doesn't matter. The idea was loosed on the world. And man, oh man, to this day, right, there's people in the streets around the world based on that universal idea. All men, now we would say all persons, are created equal. And it's still a revolutionary concept. Even in this country, we're still battling that out today. And so that idea, and there's been historians who studied and have come to the conclusion that the slaves in the United States in 1776 knew that sentence was in the Declaration of Independence for this new nation. They knew it. They knew that there was a contradiction going on here, that this new nation, in an effort to achieve its independence, was trying to rally support with this universal revolutionary notion, and that there was some hypocrisy going on with it. Everybody knew that, and yet the idea, ideas are powerful. Ideas are the most powerful. all men are created equal. It pushed slavery onto the ideological defensive. And I have here a scanned in copy of a newspaper article from the Sun Times from 2006 by Gary Nash, UCLA. And it says, 5 reasons why the Founding Fathers could have killed slavery. He wrote a book, right? And he said, contrary to conventional wisdom, the years immediately after the Revolutionary War presented an opportune time to abolish slavery. This is a what if. And historians do what ifs. I mean, again, a lot of historians are reticent to admit that what if is one of the basic tools in the toolbox of a historian. What if? Nash's point is that slavery was put on such the ideological defensive that it could have been abolished in our founding generation. And of course, that would have dramatically altered American history. Didn't turn out to be that way. But again, the fact of the matter is, for example, George Washington, in his will, freed his slaves. The law in Virginia that allowed him to do that was passed during the Revolutionary period. In other words, slavery was mitigated somewhat, even in slave states, during the Revolutionary period. Again, slavery was on the defensive because of the ideology of the American Revolution. Nash says, oh man, what a little bit more in it. We could have abolished slavery then. In a dramatically different United States. But nevertheless, even though it wasn't abolished, slavery was, and race relations and all, we've already talked about race, this misbegotten notion, that drives me crazy, race. And again, let me repeat very quickly. As a kid, and I was always kind of a logical sort. I remember one of the foundational aspects of my intellectual life was reading Sherlock Holmes stories when I was 8 years old or 9 years old, and it's like deduction, I kind of logical deduction, right? Think things through. And I remember as a kid, right, American history, race relations, the idea of race, and I remember thinking, well, what do you do with somebody who's half one race, so-called race, and half another? And that never happens. It happens all the time. We're all mutts. I remember as a kid thinking, this doesn't make a lot of sense, this race thing. So it drives me crazy, race. But you can't teach American history. You can't talk about American history without talking about race and what we call race relations. You just can't do it, as crazy as the whole damn thing makes me. The American Revolution changed race relations. It pushed slavery on the ideological defensive. Laws were changed. Now, primarily what happened was that the northern colonies, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont in particular, but also Rhode Island and Connecticut and New York, took the opportunity of the American Revolution to outlaw, either immediately or gradually, slavery. Slavery was pushed so much on the ideological defensive by this all men are created equal thing that now you're saying, well, in 1783 or in 1782, there aren't a whole lot of slaves in Massachusetts. So it's pretty easy to outlaw slavery. It's true, but nevertheless, that's what happens. Several northern states take the opportunity during the American Revolutionary era to outlaw slavery, a nation half slave and half free, as a result of the American Revolution. And you can see, I have here a chart or a table of, and what, this is from Ira Berlin's book. It says here, it is impossible to ascertain the exact number of slaves in the American colonies in 1776. The table below gives the approximate number in 1776 and the actual number according to the first census in 1790. And you can see 500,000 is the estimate in 1776. 699,000 in 1790. Then the lower table is perhaps the more interesting one. Free Negro, and this book is, back when we don't use the term Negro anymore, African American. Free African American population, 1790 to 1810. That's 20 years. You can look at that in the United States. There's 3 times as many free blacks in the 20 years after the Revolution. That is a very important development because, again, to jump ahead a little bit, the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery, think in your mind, envision an abolitionist. And it's like, you think of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, or William Graham Sumner, the publisher of the Liberator newspaper, and they're white. You think of abolitionists as white. Well, no. The abolitionist movement in the North, in the years from the Revolution up to the Civil War, was primarily, not surprisingly, in the free black community in the North. And that number is growing all the time. So now, the John Calhoun, the famous senator from South Carolina, who, the staunch defender of slavery, he's dead before South Carolina secedes in 1860, but nevertheless, John Calhoun, he wanted to outlaw abolitionism. He thought abolitionists caused the Civil War. What caused the Civil War? The abolitionist movement in the North. Well, that's primarily in the free black population in the North, the ever-growing free black population in the North. And is that surprising? That surprises who? That the free black population in the North wants to liberate their brothers and sisters in the South. It's not surprising at all. And the establishment of this large free black population is a result of the American Revolution. Because as the cotton revolution takes place, the invention of the cotton gin and the establishment of the first industrial revolution in England, the textile mills, the cotton boom, because the American Revolution occurred before the cotton boom. And that's one of the reasons that slavery was pushed on the defensive, was because it was losing its economic salience. Also, the cotton boom in the early 1800s will reinvigorate slavery as an economic institution. And so the ability of masters to free their slaves and the ability of slaves to become free will become ever harder as the cotton empire grows. But the American Revolution is this window of more lenient laws concerning the emancipation of slaves and the establishment of free slaves, free blacks in the North. It's an important development in American history, the American Revolution. Here's another chart about from the Enduring Vision, a textbook, about free blacks as a percentage of the population. And you can see, that in Massachusetts, 100%, Vermont, 100%. There are no slaves. And it says here, let me read this. Within a generation of the Declaration of Independence, a large free black population emerged that included every ninth African American. In the North, only New Jersey and New York did most blacks remain slaves. Almost half of all free blacks lived in the South. Because again, their ability to live as free blacks in a slave state was enhanced by the Revolution. That by the time of the Civil War, it is virtually impossible for an African American to be free in Virginia or North Carolina or South Carolina. That window of opportunity during the all men are created equal era, you might call it, goes away as cotton booms and slavery becomes more important, and the fist comes back. And here we have a map of legal changes to slavery, 1777 to 1804. And you can see abolished slavery, the North, gradual emancipation, the middle colonies, and then leniency on masters being able to free their slaves in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, sort of the northern slave states. And then south there was not much change. There was some change, some liberation of slave codes in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia during this period, but not as much as in Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. Now, finally I want to add on here a note about how the American Revolution affected women and women's rights. And mostly, not very much. But again, there was some underlying changes. And most historians think the most important one was a change in the ability of women to become educated. In 50 years after the Revolution, over 400 female academies were founded in the United States. And again, Mary Beth Norton and Linda Kerber wrote famous books about the idea of Republican motherhood, that during the Revolution, that women were expected to raise patriots, their sons. They were expected to raise enlightened, Republican, revolutionary sons to guide the new republic. And so in order to do that, they had to be educated themselves. Now again, here we're talking about upper middle class and upper class women, right? This of course didn't filter down to the frontier farmer housewife out in Kentucky. And there were some changes in some states liberalizing divorce laws, because back in that era, divorce laws were heavily in favor of the man. But the revolution, again, the revolution did play a role in the ultimate women's movement.